Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, the next part of our 3D scan to part series, we're going to carry on with the wide body fender design on my 1984 Mitsubishi Starion. So as I mentioned in the last video, it's always important when you start a process like this to take certain steps as you go because the design is going to become more and more complicated to handle the more detail we begin to add. So we're approaching this by first creating the shape of the fender without the wheel opening, and then we'll create the wheel opening where we want it to be. Now, with a design like this, there are always different ways in which we can approach it. Now, I had already showed you a preview of sort of design that I was playing around with, keeping the stock or the OEM sort of flare shape and pushing it out and making it a wider version. As I mentioned in that last video, this car also came as a wide body from the factory. The way that it worked is it kept the same body line. The fenders are actually interchangeable. And from about here, it started to flare out in that very boxy 80s style. Now, if I wanted to do that, I could just buy those fenders and bolt them on and go about my way. But that's obviously not the point of this. We want to design something really unique and really custom. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to take a different approach than the version that I showed you. I'm not sure which one I'm going to 3D print, but let's go a little bit more extreme with this. Let's make it wider. Let's make it more sort of unique. So what we're going to do is we're going to carry on with this process. And again, I'm going to try to keep these videos to about 30 minutes. I know that nobody out there is going to be designing a part like this, but hopefully there are bits of information that are going to be important to you. So in that last video, we started off by really looking at, in this case, I'm going to go into box display, really looking at the overall shape of the fender. We started by creating these upper faces, and then we worked our way down and started to sort of reimagine the lines and the angles. So before I go any further, what I want to do is I want to continue to fix what we have here. When we ended that last video, we angled this forward and we began to sort of change the taper so it matched with the lines of the car. And now we need to carry that forward and just sort of smooth everything out before we add any more detail. So I'm going to start by double clicking this front edge. Then I'm going to use Control and deselect that upper piece. I'm going to go to Modify and Edit Form. I'm going to change my pivot point to this top position here. And then I'm going to rotate this forward. Now, remember, the intent of this is to build an overfender. It's only going to attach to the fender. It's going to go around the marker light and up onto this portion of the fender. So this bit here doesn't really matter. However, it is extremely tough for us to get the good detail that we want around the marker light and maintain a really nice surface. So the detail about cutting it out around the marker light and potentially flaring it back into the fender, that's probably going to be done as a surface downstream. But what we really want to do is we want to focus on making sure that the data that we have here has nice consistent flow of edges. And we can already see that this edge right here doesn't have a nice flow. We've got quite a bit of an angle difference between these edges. So now we're going to go in and we're going to take care of some of those. This detail here should also be straight across the car. So when we look at that detail on the car, that is going to be something, I'm going to go ahead and use Control-4 to hide the edge. That's going to be something that is a straight line and it's carried onto the bumper. So these are all things that we want to make sure that we fix before we start adding any more detail. So I'm going to take both of these edges and I want to rotate them. So once again, I'm going to move my pivot point. This time I'm going to put it right in the middle. And then I could rotate those. There's also another way that we could do this. If the rotation was a little too tricky, one thing that we can do is we can deselect these and we can say grab these vertices here. I'm going to go to set pivot point and put it right here. And then I'm going to scale this vertically until I get down to 0. And we can manually enter a 0 and then click here. And we're going to do the same thing to the other edge. Set pivot point, put it right here. And then we're going to scale this down until it gets to 0. Now, essentially what we're doing is we're scaling the distance between those points in a single direction. In this case, based on our coordinate system, it's in the Z direction. So that means any different change in direction that we had from the top, in this case, the X or the Y, that's not going to be affected because we're only doing it vertically. So now that we got that sorted out and that is a nice straight line, I want to fix the rest of this. I want to sort of retopologize this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Modify insert point. I'm using a simple insertion mode right now. And where this starts to change angle here, I want to begin to change the angle. So I'm going to start to insert some points and just work my way forward. Then I'm going to double click this edge and hit delete. So what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to sort of straighten that out. Now I'm not really happy with some of this, and I can go in and make some manual adjustments if I want. I try to avoid making manual adjustments this early in a design. I want to use things like scaling and just rotating entire edges. It's just a little bit easier to make sure that we have a nice, consistent, smooth transition. Next, I'm going to go to modify and insert point. And what I want to do from up here is I'm just going to draw a line that is approximately in between these angles. I'm going to hit enter, double click this, and delete it. Now, if that looks a little bit too big, we can also go and use things like slide edge. We can take this edge and slide it to the left a little bit, and that'll automatically transition or average it between these two. Same thing over here. If we want to make some adjustments, I can take that edge and use slide edge, maybe pull it over just a little bit. And remember, the back edge, the door is not completely straight, so I'm going to leave that little bit of a curve in it. This is looking okay. It's probably not perfect, so I want to make just a couple other minor adjustments. Now, this might seem like quite a pain to do, but it's really important when you're working in forms that you really have a good idea and understanding about the way in which forms work. They're really complicated to get a hold of, but if you start slowly, work in box display, and you try to make sure that the layout here is very consistent, it'll really go a long way in making sure that your designs are nice and clean. Now, one thing I can tell right away is that this edge right here and this edge are not parallel. It looks like this edge here is starting to taper away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this entire edge, I'm going to reset my pivot point, put it all the way at the back here, and then I want to try to scale this vertically. Now you can see if I scale it vertically that it is actually moving, but we don't necessarily know if scaling it vertically is making it horizontal. So I'm going to use Control Z to undo. And if I grab the vertices, let's go ahead and just grab all of these. And this time I'm going to set my pivot point at the front and try to scale them vertically. So you can see that they're able to go up and down, but once we get close to 0, it is creating a horizontal line, and we can see that they're not exactly horizontal relative to each other. Now, this could potentially be a problem with the alignment of the scan. So for example, if we bring the scan back, the main thing that we want to see is that this line right here, which is just below the opening in the fender, is also at the same position at the back of the fender. That looks pretty good. This one here looks to be a little bit high, but remember that the box display and the smooth display are not going to be in the exact same location. So as long as it's in the same position relative to the front and back, then we're okay. And it looks to me like in the front, it might be a little bit low, and in the back, it might be a little bit high. If we take a look at this one, you can see that this point is just above that position on the fender. And if we go forward, it might be kind of hard to see, but what we can do is actually select those points and hide the body, and we can see where they line up. So it's just below that edge here. If we take a look back here, it's just above. So this tells me that those two edges are not horizontal, and these are the ones that I want to fix. This one here is fine, but these ones here are not. So in order to do that, I want to find the one that is in the correct position, in this case the front, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to select all the vertices, and then I'm going to reset my pivot point to the front. And I want to scale them down until they're at 0. I'm going to repeat the process for the next set. So once again, I'm going to manually select all those points. When I'm doing something like this, I like to select the vertices as opposed to the entire edge. Not necessarily anything that you have to do. It's just kind of my personal preference. Visually, it's a little bit easier for me to see. So now what we want to see is that at the front and the back, these vertices are lining up with the correct positions on the scan. So you can see this one is right there on that edge. This one is right there in the transition. When we go to the front on the bumper, right at the edge and in that transition. So now I'm happy with those locations. Keeping in mind, remembering that the position of those in the smooth display with Alt and 3 is different than the position in the box display. But again, it's important that we get in the mindset of working in this box display for as long as possible because it's really going to help us solidify the way in which the design flows and translates. So don't get too hung up on it perfectly matching the curvature and the shape and smooth display. But what we really want to focus on is making sure that we've got these controlling edges in the box display where we want them. I'm going to show you by the end of this video how we can add those additional edges and details to help make sure that we control those edges and their locations. Making hard edges flow properly inside of forms is a thing that's actually really difficult to do. It's a little bit harder than it is to make nice, smooth flowing shapes. So it's definitely going to be important that you do pay attention to how we do that. Now that we've got this overall shape of the fender, again, we are not looking specifically at the wheel opening. We're just looking at the underlying fender shape because we want to have a nice base reference and then build from there. Whenever you're building out a wide body, it can be very easy to sort of start out making it really extravagant and bulge it out. However, if you're trying to follow some of these body lines that you have on a stock car like this, I really want to maintain these hard edges and carry them into the design. I find that this is a really good exercise to make sure that we can position these edges where we want them. So I'm going to take this bottom edge. This bottom edge ends up rolling underneath and then the air dam attaches to it. So I want to capture that. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to that bottom edge, hold down Alt, and begin dragging this under. Now this doesn't have to come all the way under, but I do want that reference there. And again, we are going to be building an over fender. I'm not completely redesigning this entire fender, but I do want to capture that detail. The next thing I'm going to do is I want to capture this edge as it comes up and over. Now, as I mentioned originally, or at least in the version I showed before, I kind of took this edge right here. I'm going to go ahead and hide my edges using Control and 4. I sort of took this design element on the car and I carried it down and kept that bulge going out. However, in talking to another user that had some of these cars, he brought up the interesting point of taking the flare off this top edge and bringing it out. Now, there are a couple things that we need to consider if that's the route we're going. One is that this flat edge actually carries through the door. Now you can kind of see it in a little bit of scan we have. It carries through the door and it wraps around the driver's window and goes up and starts to transition away. So this edge is critical to the overall design and I need to maintain it. However, we can maintain it from a side view. If the fender is going to be an over fender, and let's say we leave a gap between the stock fender underneath and this new bulged out wide version, if we carry that edge where it is right now from the side view, and from the top view it's wider out, that'll still capture the same design element that I want to go for. So what we're going to do is we're going to play around with that. I don't necessarily know what this is going to look like, but that's all part of the process. If you are creating your own version and you have hand sketches or a design that you want to go with, that's perfectly fine. But a lot of times I find that I just get into CAD and in 3D and I start playing around and just explore 3D and figure out what I want to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to carry this edge up and then over the top of the fender. And there are a couple things that we need to be careful with here. I'm not going to worry about the front for right now. However, we will get to that. But this is where there is a break in the continuity. So if we double click an edge, it's going to carry all the way across the top, but it will stop here. And that's okay. We can come back and fix that. But what we're going to do first is we're going to move this up just a little bit and get it closer to that transition on the car. And then I'm going to hold down Alt and I'm going to extrude this up. And what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to get the back edge where it should be. And I'm not really worried about the front edge. And there's a couple reasons for that. Once we have it here, before I extrude anything else, I want to fix the position of this edge. Now, as I mentioned before, it's important that we use tools like scale and that we rotate entire edges on the design. And this is not really any different. So I'm going to double click that edge. I mentioned that I like to do this with vertices, but we'll do it with the edge for this case. going to set the pivot point at the back, and this is where I made sure that I set the edge properly. And then I'm just going to go ahead and scale this until that front edge is where I want it on the car. Now you'll notice that it's not a perfect transition yet because it does still bulge out in the middle. So we are going to have to do a little bit of work. If we rotate it, we can see that it's kind of still up in the air. But this does get us closer because it puts that front edge approximately where it needs to be. The other thing that we need to do is we need to take a look at this from the top. So I'm going to double click the mouse wheel. I'm going to reset my pivot point. I don't know why this thing floats around so much, but I'm going to reset my pivot point to the back. Again, I know that's the right location. And then I'm going to begin using scale until that edge lines up where I want it to here at the front. So you can see it still needs to come back a little bit. This might be hard to do, but you're going to go ahead and just play around with it a little bit. What we're looking to do is get it roughly right. Again, it's important to note that in box display and smooth display, these edges are going to be in different locations. However, once we begin adding additional control edges that are going to help keep the curvature where we want it, that's when these box display edges really start to hold the shape, and that's what we're looking for. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to bring these mid edges down to match the fender. And to do that, we're going to have to use some other tools. We're just going to have to manually move them. So to move it manually, we don't want to take the entire edge. We could try to scale points down based on locations, and that might work okay, but we also could try to manually move them. Now, as I mentioned, it's important that we use tools like scale because they can get us to take an entire edge and make a consistent transition across it. So the first thing that I am going to do is I'm going to try to scale some of these vertices down. So for example, I'm going to take, let's go ahead and just take a couple of these. We're going to leave those back too. I'm going to reset the pivot point to this front edge, and that's because the front edge is where I want it. That's a good 0 reference. And looking at this from the front, I'm still going to scale vertically, and I just want to pull that down and pull it down until it meets the fender. So again, that looks pretty good. It doesn't have to be perfect. And you'll notice that not everything moved properly because we omitted some of these vertices. So I think that looks pretty good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one and move it manually. And when we move it manually, one thing that I want to pay attention to is that I'm only moving it vertically. Now from this direction, this will allow us to move it in plane. And when we do that, I want to pay attention to the numbers and make sure that that first number stays 0, which means that I'm not moving it left or right. And then I can move it up and down very freely. If I were just to use the vertical one, you can see that it snaps every 5 millimeters at the zoom level, and that's not enough for me to get the right position. So that looks pretty good so far. I'm happy with the location. So I'm going to double click that edge once more, go to my front view, and I'm going to pull it up just slightly. If I want to make any adjustments to it, now would be a good time. So if I'm not happy with, let's say, some of these intermediate vertices, if I want to move them, I can move them manually now. But once again, it's important that we try to make things nice and smooth and consistent because this will help us later on. So if there's any change that needs to happen to keep this nice and smooth, now would be the time to do it. And as we look at this, you can see it starts to get wider here, and that's how it actually works on the car. It starts out very narrow, and then it gets wider toward the back. So we would expect to see that when we look at this here. And once again, another trick that we can do is we can select these vertices, and then we can hide the body and show the mesh, and the vertices will stay selected. So we want to actually make sure that we're going relatively close to that edge. You can see a couple of the ones inside of here are a little bit low. So what I'm going to do is hold down Shift, and I'm going to bring back this body, and I'm going to deselect a couple of these. So those front ones there, I think the back ones are okay. So I'm going to deselect these as well, holding down Shift. And then I want to move a couple of these points up. Well, once again, I'm going to use this free move that allows me to move in plane, but I want to make sure that I check on that left number, make sure that it stays at 0. I'm going to hide this and show the mesh. They look kind of close. going to go ahead and bring the body back, hide it. That's looking a little bit better. I think I want to move this one just a little bit more. So I'm going to deselect these. I'm going to move this one up. Once again, this might seem like it's taking a lot of extra time now to get these right, and it is an extremely important step. I'm not sure if I've said that before or not, but if you if you haven't heard it before, this is important. If you are planning on doing something with a design like this, taking the time to manipulate these now and get them as close as you can is going to help you downstream. It's just part of the process. Now, you also might be thinking to yourself, why don't I use some of the tools that we have at our disposal? Things like under the modify menu, we've got the pull tool that allow me to pull the control vertices directly to the mesh. Well, the problem is we only want to use that when we're near the very end of our design, and we have to create something that has all of the different divisions on it that perfectly matches our fender. At this stage, we're not quite ready for it because we're really going to be moving these edges around. We're going to be flaring this out, making it a bit more wide and extreme. So I'm not really concerned with it hitting those points, but what I'm more concerned with is that I'm following the OEM design language of the shape. So now I'm going to take that upper edge, I'm going to go to modify, and once again, I am going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to extrude it in. And I want to make sure that my edge in the back is where I want it. Then I'm going to go to a top view. I'm going to reset my pivot point. I'm going to put it all the way in the back here. And then I'm going to use the scale to scale it horizontally until it looks like I can just see the mesh on the inside there. It should be a fairly straight line, at least on this car. Not all cars are going to be like that, but on this car, it's a fairly straight line. And one thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to try to match this shape right here, just simply because that's going to get cut out later. Now, once I have that, I also want to take this edge back a little bit. And once again, I'm watching that left number. I want that to be 0 because I don't want to move at all in the X direction. I only want to move in the Y direction. So once we have that, at this point, if I hide the mesh, that's starting to look like a very low poly or low resolution version of this fender. Now, once again, we are omitting the wheel opening for now. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating that wheel opening where we want it, and then we are going to eventually attach the two. I will talk about one version of this where you can do that downstream with surfaces, but ultimately we're going to spend our time in forms, and we're going to try to do it all with forms. So at this stage, I'm pretty happy with the way everything is laid out. I could probably sit here for another hour just moving things around and getting it closer, but that's really not going to be very interesting to watch. So I think what we have is close enough. The next step that I want to do is I want to start to build this around the front of the fender because we are going to be sort of recreating this portion of the fender. I need to bring the rest of this forward. That's going to be a little bit trickier to do just simply based on the way that this is shaped. So I'm going to take this front edge. I'm going to omit these two upper pieces. I'm going to reset my pivot point. Again, this thing always just seems to be in the wrong location. I'm going to reset the pivot point up here. I'm going to view this from my right side. And I'm going to try to rotate that forward a little bit. Again, we don't care about the stuff down here. That's all going to get cut away. All we really care about is matching the fender shape. Now, once we're happy with that, what we can do is we can take that front edge. I'm going to hold down Control and deselect these. I'm going to do this from a top view. We can take that front edge, hold down Alt, and extrude it forward. I'm going to let go of Alt, hold down Alt one more time, and extrude it around that fender. And when we do that, of course, it's not going to be perfect. But what this is going to allow us to do is now we've got these edges that we can manipulate. And I think it's always important that we do this in plane. So what I mean by that is I'm looking at this from the side, and then I'm going to rotate around to my front view. And I want to make sure that these are going to line up. And I'm going to rotate around to my top view and make sure that everything lines up. I'm going to double click this one here. I'm going to scale it down, and then I'm going to move it over. Again, because I don't really care what happens up here, I really am only interested in this, and then I can go ahead and sort of manipulate those downstream if I want to. Now that I have that little section there, I can always spend a little bit more time cleaning it up, but we need to think about how we're going to connect these together. If I go into Smooth Display just to take a look and I hide the base, you can see that we've sort of built this rolled section here. It starts to overlap, so this is definitely an area that we need to fix. And what I want to do is I'm just going to clean that up a little bit from the front. So I want to find the area that's overlapping. You might need to select a few vertices and just sort of pull them over until you get something that is not overlapping itself. Box display is really helpful for that. Now I'm going to go back into box display. I'm going to use modify and weld vertices. And because I'm happy with the location of everything up top, I'm going to take this vertex and weld it to that one, and then this one and weld it to that one. So if we go back to smooth display, now what we've done is we've created a star point in this corner. This is where 3 or 5 edges are coming together, or it can be more than 5, but really anything but 4. And we need to take a look at the transition of the fender. Again, this is getting a little tricky, but you can see this back edge sort of falls away. And we want to make sure that that back edge doesn't fall away because that's not how it is on the car. So I'm going to take these edges, I'll hold down Shift or Control and double click between them. And then we're just going to simply move this forward. And I'm going to actually pull it up a little bit. And what I'm looking for here, if we look at this top section, we can see a very consistent width here. And that's what I'm trying to match as I move those around manually. So that's really all I'm doing there. And if I take a look at it in smooth display, it should look pretty good. All right, at this point, we are coming close to 30 minutes, which is again where I said I was going to stop at. So what I want to do now, I'm going to do a quick save. And then I want to show you how we can control these edges. So as I mentioned, the edges in box display and the edges in smooth display are not in the same location. There are things that you can do to help that. For example, make uniform. If we use that on this, it will pull and smooth things out. I'm going to use Control Z to undo that because that's not what I want to do just yet. But what I like to do, and one of my new favorite tools in here, is the Bevel tool. Now, part of the reason the Bevel tool is nice is because it allows us to take an edge that's existing. We can move that edge in one direction and insert another edge in the other direction. I'm going to show you the difference between Bevel and the difference between using something like Insert Edge. So with Bevel, we're taking our selected edge. In this case, we're going to add a bevel location at 0.1. By default, it's probably 0.5, but it remembers the last setting that you used in this session. So I'm going to use 0.1 and insert one segment. So what that does is it takes our current edge, moves it 10% of the distance between it and the next edge, and then it inserts another edge 10% of the distance between the other edge. We're going to say OK. And what this does is it creates a nice transition between those. Now, conversely, if I was to go in and use Insert Edge, and let's say that we wanted to insert an edge at 10%, this would be minus 0.1 here. What's going to end up happening when we use this simple insertion mode is it's going to stick that edge right there, and it's not going to do anything with this. And what this means is we're going to end up with these two lines or these two edges being completely collinear. They're completely straight. And this is bad for geometry because remember, when we're talking about the underlying shape, so if we use a control frame display, what we have is these edges are controlling the tangency of the underlying surface. So when you have edges like this, what you end up having is tangency controlled at this edge. And then in the middle, what we're doing is we're driving the tangency of that curve in the corner based on how close these two edges are together. If we make them closer, it's going to tighten it up. So for example, if I take this edge and let's say slide it, if I pull that edge closer, what's going to end up happening is it's going to make that transition tighter. I'm going to use Control Z to undo that. But this one down here, we've essentially told it that the tangency direction is this straight line. But once we transition to this other edge, it kind of doesn't really know what to do because really the transition should either be going positive or negative, concave or convex. So inserting an edge like this is not going to be good for curvature. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete that. We're going to select this edge and we're going to use bevel. Once again, I'm going to use that 0.1, but keep in mind here that that 0.1 again is the percentage of the distance between the selected edge and the next edge. Up here, they were relatively close in terms of the length of those edges. Down here, however, you'll notice that this 10% is quite a bit farther away from our selected edge. I'm going to say OK and allow it to create that, and I'm going to take a look at it in smooth display. When we look at it in smooth display, if I hide my edges with Control 4, you can see that we do see that transition pretty nicely on the car. We'll probably need to do a bit of work up here to make it match the underlying fender. You can see it's not exactly right in that corner. It does need a bit more work. That's okay. But it does give us a good idea how we can sort of control those transitions. So let's do the same process down here. We're going to say bevel. I'm going to use 0.1 just kind of as my default number for right now. Bevel. We're going to go to smooth display, Control 4 to hide my edges. And you can see we're carrying those edges on the design. Now what you can do is you can put those edges closer together or farther apart, depending on what you want to do with your own design. But this will give us a good starting point for figuring out how we can control them. Now with our design, we're not quite to that point yet. It's important that we don't get too hung up on adding too much detail early on in the design. So what I'm going to do is actually Control Z. I'm going to undo those bevels because I'm not ready for those bevels yet. I don't think we're far enough in the design to worry about that. I still need to do a bit of work here to control the transition to match the mesh in that corner. And then we need to figure out what the shape is going to be and where the wheel arch is going to be. But as I said, I'm trying to keep these around 30 minutes, so that's going to be the end of this video. I know it doesn't seem like we've made much progress, but I promise you that spending the time now to make sure that what you're creating at this base level has consistent spacing, has the edge flow that you're looking at, and it has the overall shape that you're trying to work with will save you a lot of headaches downstream. I've helped a lot of people. I've seen a lot of designs where people have sent me and they're having trouble controlling the shape because they get things like waves in the surfaces going in and out, or they just have too many edges. You really don't need that many edges to control a design, at least at this stage. So it's really important that you take the time and understand the basic layout of whatever you're creating. If you're following along with me, then you can decide to go up over the top like I have here. You can decide to just stay here and bulge the fender out. Whatever you want to do is completely fine. I am going to provide a file each time we start a new video, so you'll be able to download wherever I'm at. So feel free to play around, learn the way that the tools work, play around with the transform using scale, selecting edges and vertices, moving things around, but just get a good foundational understanding of how to move and manipulate things. But the end goal should be something that has a consistent distance between these edges. As I mentioned, I could probably spend another hour just cleaning this up, but I'm not going to do any sort of camera trickery. I'm going to work through the entire thing with you. But it's important that you do spend that time now, and it'll save you a lot of sort of trouble and headache later. At this point, if you have any questions on what we've done so far, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.